It's Wednesday now, middle of the week. You guys have hopefully gotten yourselves into a routine. You're enjoying yourselves, but not too much. You're getting some rest. I've been getting a good night's sleep. I usually stay at the Game Day Center, which is just behind the Institute, but this year I'm staying at a hotel down the road. There's a new Holiday Inn Express down by the interstate. And it's very nice, and I've always wanted to stay there because I'm hoping that at the end of this lecture, one of you will ask me, well, how long have you been studying Hayek? And I can say, oh, I've never read anything by Hayek, but I did stay in a Holiday Inn Express last night. I'm waiting years for the opportunity to do something like that. Actually, I do have some qualifications to give a lecture providing an overview of Hayek's life and work. The main qualification is that Hayek and I share a birthday. We're both born on May the 8th. Hayek in 1899. Myself a year or two later. Also, another interesting story is has to do with the Hayek Chair, which I used to hold. Now, let me explain. In academia, professors have different ranks, and the highest rank that one can have in a university is what's called a chaired position, an endowed position or endowed chair. And so these are positions that are funded with supplemental resources provided by an endowed fund. I see Walter Block in the back. Walter holds an endowed chair at the at Loyola University in New Orleans. And these chaired positions are usually named after someone. They're often named after the donor or contributor who provided the resources. Sometimes they're named in honor of a famous scholar or a famous figure at the university. Well, I used to hold the Hayek Chair. And let me explain how this came about. As a graduate student, I worked for a philosopher who was then at the Hoover Institution, Bill Bartley, who you might know if you've seen his writings. He wrote as W.W. Bartley III. He was a student of Karl Popper, was close to Popper, and actually quite close to Hayek as well. Now, Bartley was writing a biography of Hayek in the late 1980s, and he spent several months living in Germany, where Hayek was living in Freiburg at the time, spending a lot of time with Hayek doing interviews. And he bought a car when he was in Germany. He bought an Audi, and he drove Hayek around in this Audi. And then when he returned to the U.S., he had the car shipped back to him in the U.S. and drove it around in California. And he subsequently sold the car to me. So I used to drive around in a car, the passenger seat of which was the Hayek Chair, the chair where Hayek had sat. Of course, I never washed the upholstery because I wanted the aura, the essence of Hayek to be right there. One of the reasons we have a lecture summarizing Hayek's work is because he's something of a difficult figure to understand and sometimes a little bit difficult to place in the broader context of the Austrian school. Hayek is by far the best known of all the modern Austrians, better known than Mises or Rothbard, certainly better known than Menger or boehm-bawerk. His work is read by historians and political scientists and people outside of economics as well. Hayek was a very prolific writer. His publications appeared over a span of 7 decades. He is the only Austrian to win a Nobel Prize, receiving the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1974. Actually shared it with his arch nemesis, the Swedish socialist Gunnar Myrdal. The committee wanted to balance things out, presumably. And when Hayek won the Nobel, this gave tremendous momentum to what was then a burgeoning revival of the Austrian school in the U.S. Hayek was also a well-known popular figure. He gained fame in the 1940s in the U.S. and the U.K. for his very popular book, The Road to Serfdom, which was a bestseller, and as far as I know, is the only work by an Austrian economist to have been reproduced in Reader's Digest. So Reader's Digest serialized Hayek's book in the 1940s, and he came and gave a lecture tour to great acclaim here in the U.S., kind of as a celebrity. Partly because of this book, and other writings, Hayek became known at that time as one of the leading intellectual defenders of classical liberalism, one of the great opponents of statism, both in its communist and fascist varieties. Hayek founded the Mont Pelerin Society in 1947, the first sort of international academic association for free market intellectuals. We often take it for granted now that groups like the Mises Institute and the Foundation for Economic Education and the Independent Institute and other think tanks and educational and policy associations have always been around, but these were completely unknown in the mid-20th century, and Hayek was created the first sort of modern free market institution. So all in all, Hayek's career and Hayek's work have had a tremendous impact on the modern Austrian school and on classical liberal scholarship in the 20th and 21st centuries. I'm only going to talk today about Hayek's contributions to economics, just to keep things a little bit more narrowly focused, but we'll have opportunities later in the week to talk about his work in political theory and history and law and so on. Now, I have to start with a caveat, which is that Hayek is not always an easy writer to understand. There's a huge secondary literature trying to interpret, what Hayek really meant by this or that, which is, an indication either of great profundity or of very poor writing. I think there's a combination of both in Hayek. He once described himself in his essay, Two Types of Mind, as what he called a puzzler or a muddler. It's a great essay where Hayek describes two different intellectual types. The first, what he calls the master of his subject, is the kind of scholar who knows all the literature, remembers everything, has a very synthesized understanding, can immediately recall the most important contributions or theories or ideas or writers. The other type, of which Hayek himself was a representative, is a person who is sort of very creative and interesting, but idiosyncratic and original. Hayek says, quote, "I owed whatever worthwhile new ideas I ever had to not being able to remember what every competent specialist is supposed to have at his fingertips." You can't use that in an oral examination, with your professors, but whenever I saw a new light on something, it was as the result of a painful effort to reconstruct an argument which most competent economists would effortlessly and instantly reproduce. Hayek was a student of Friedrich von Wieser, who was also, Hayek describes as a puzzler, the puzzler type, as opposed to Wieser's brother-in-law, Eugen von boehm-bawerk, who was much more the master of the subject type. So as I say, there's a lot of interpretations of Hayek. In fact, just to show you some recent highlights in this vast secondary literature, which has dozens of books and hundreds of articles, there are two biographical works by Alan Ebenstein, which came out a few years ago, a biography in 2001, and then a more interpretive account in 2003 called Hayek's Journey. I think I have pictures. Here are the two Ebenstein books. So I mentioned before that Bill Bartley had been working on a Hayek biography, but he did not complete it before he died. Some of the materials were published in a book called Hayek on Hayek, which I think we have out here. It's some transcripts of some interviews and some autobiographical notes produced by Hayek. Bruce Caldwell has also written a book called Hayek's Challenge. And there's also, back up, very interesting exchange between Joe Salerno, who you've heard this week, and Bruce Caldwell, who's now general editor of the collected works of F.A. Hayek, on the question of on Hayek's place within the Austrian school, where Professor Salerno makes the argument that much of Hayek's work is more in the Walrasian tradition, of which Wieser himself was a representative, rather than strictly the Mengerian tradition. And Caldwell objects to this characterization. There's a good back and forth, 2 or 3 articles that are worth checking out. And of course, all of Hayek's writings are being produced in a standard edition called The Collected Works of F.A. Hayek. think I have some samples. And several of them are out there on the bookshelves. There's Hayek on Hayek, the one on the bottom left. I personally think Volume 4 is the most outstanding volume in the series, but you may feel differently. Okay, well, who was this guy? What is his background? Well, Hayek was born in Vienna, born into a distinguished family of Viennese intellectuals. His father was a well-known physician and an amateur botanist. One of his grandfathers, a statistician, was a close friend of boehm-bawerk. And the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein was Hayek's second cousin. Hayek went to school at the University of Vienna in the late 19-teens and early 1920s when it was one of the top places in the world to study economics. Initially, Hayek was sort of a mild Fabian socialist, but he was converted to liberalism, to classical liberalism, by Mises' book, Socialism. Hayek said, quote, "To none of us young men who read that book when it appeared, the world was ever the same again." He says he didn't buy the arguments in their entirety, but gradually over time, through interaction with Mises, Hayek became converted to classical liberalism. Excuse me. Hayek began attending Mises' private seminar at the Vienna Chamber of Commerce, and as I think you've heard, this was a place where the leading scholars, young scholars in economics and related fields would gather at Mises' office for private discussions on a weekly basis. No, it wasn't a formal course. They didn't receive any academic credit for it. They did it purely for their own intellectual consumption. Others in the group with Hayek included some economists who subsequently became very well known. Gottfried Haberler, who taught at Harvard, Fritz Machlup was later a professor at Princeton, Oscar Morgenstern, who co-authored the pioneering book on game theory with John von Neumann in 1944, Paul Rosenstein-Rodan, who ended up at MIT, also Richard von Striegel, Karl Schlesinger, Felix Kaufmann, Alfred Schutz, the sociologist, and Carl Menger Jr., a famous mathematician and son of our Carl Menger. And Hayek became kind of the leader of this, what was called the fourth generation of the Austrian school. Menger being the first, boehm-bawerk and Wieser being the second, and then Mises and his contemporaries representing the third. Hayek's early research was on the business cycle and the Austrian theory of capital. And he built on insights that Mises had provided in Mises' 1912 book, The Theory of Money and Credit. Hayek had a visit to the U.S. In the 1920s, the 1924-25 academic year. He took a tour of the U.S. He was very impressed with the institutionalist Wesley Clare Mitchell at Columbia, and Mitchell was inaugurating a new research program to collect statistics on sort of macroeconomic indicators, as we would call them now, to try to do empirical research on business cycles. Mitchell then founded the NBER, National Bureau of Economic Research. And when Hayek returned to Vienna, with Mises' help, he set up a similar institute in Vienna called the Austrian Institute for Business Cycle Research to collect empirical data for studies of business cycles in Europe. And so Hayek was made the head of this institute with Mises' help. And Haberler was his assistant. As a result of Hayek's writings on the business cycle, he was invited to give a series of lectures at the London School of Economics in the early 1930s, in 1930. And his lectures caused he made a very favorable impression, a big splash. Everyone was all abuzz about these wonderful lectures. And as a result, LSE offered him a position. They offered him one of these chaired positions that I described, called the Took Chair in Economics and Statistics, which he accepted in 1931 when he was only 32, which is pretty young to hold such a distinguished chaired position. So Hayek moved from Vienna to London as a professor at the LSE. The LSE at that time was sort of an up-and-coming department, becoming known as a rival to the most prestigious university in England in economics, which was Cambridge, with Pigou, Marshall, Pigou, Keynes, and so on. Among the faculty and grad students at the LSE in those days were Lionel Robbins, the one who brought Hayek to the LSE, J.R. Hicks, later Nobel laureate, Arnold Plant, Dennis Robertson, Abba Lerner, Kenneth Boulding, G.L.S. Shackle. Ronald Coase was a student there at the time. Ludwig Lachmann later came as a colleague of Hayek. Because of Hayek's work and other writings by others at the LSE, such as Lionel Robbins, the Austrian understanding of the business cycle, which you've learned about this week, became widely known and accepted in the English-speaking world as probably the best explanation for the Great Depression, which they were then in the middle of. Hayek also made some contributions to the socialist calculation debate. He edited a 1935 book called Collectivist Economic Planning, which is where Mises' 1920 essay appeared in English for the first time. Okay, now, as I said, Hayek's theory of the business cycle was was becoming widely known and was very well respected at this time. Indeed, Hayek was regarded in academic circles as the leading rival to John Maynard Keynes. He had an exchange with Keynes in the Economic Journal on Keynes's book Treatise on Money. Hayek wrote a very lengthy two-part review essay on Keynes's treatise, which was completely devastating. Keynes wrote a lengthy reply. Hayek a rejoinder. They went back and forth. So these two became known as great rivals or sort of peers in the theory of money and the business cycle, which raises an interesting puzzle for historians of economic thought, which is the following: if Hayek was so widely respected as a critic and rival of Keynes, why is it when Keynes came out with his general theory in 1936, Hayek never wrote anything in reply? He didn't review the book in any of the journals. He never wrote an essay or published a book or wrote anything sort of in refutation of the fallacies in Keynes's book. And some people have sort of lamented, oh, if only Hayek had risen up and smashed the general theory when it first came out, maybe we wouldn't have been saddled with decades of horrible Keynesian macroeconomics. But Hayek remained silent. No one knows exactly why. There are several different explanations, plausible explanations floating around. One is personal. Hayek and Keynes were good friends. Keynes was very charming, and perhaps Hayek just didn't want to take him on. Also, Hayek's style in person, he tended not to be sort of he didn't confront people head on. He was sort of diplomatic in how he put things. You might know that his book, The Road to Serfdom, is dedicated to the socialists of all parties. And he meant that not in an ironic or mean-spirited way, but he meant quite honestly, you socialists are good guys, you're just a little bit mistaken. I'm hoping that you'll read my book and become converted. So maybe he just didn't want to have a direct confrontation with Keynes on this point. Hayek himself had said that at this point in his career he was a little bit tired of engaging in controversy. He felt like he'd already had an argument with Keynes on the Treatise on Money. He'd been involved in the controversy over socialism. He just didn't want to be involved in any more controversies. I think a more likely explanation is a strategic one, which Hayek has also explained in his memoirs, namely that Keynes was a really shifty guy, that the theories in Keynes' general theory of employment, interest, and money are quite different from the theories expounded in Keynes' earlier book, The Treatise on Money. And Hayek says, well, if I put a lot of effort into a refutation of the general theory, well, then Keynes will just come out with another book, the completely different theory, and it will have all been a waste of time. In other words, it's easy for us today in hindsight to pick out this book, the general theory that had great influence not to the good from our perspective, and say it should have been nipped in the bud. But at the time, maybe no one knew. No one could have predicted that the book would, and its framework would have the kind of staying power that it did. Hayek thought what was a smarter move at this time was just to ignore Keynes and to work on his own theory, to develop his own positive theory of capital and the business cycle. So he started working on this sort of long, detailed exposition, which unfortunately didn't come out until 1941, publishes The Pure Theory of Capital, and it kind of sunk like a stone, didn't have much influence. And by 1941, the Keynesian revolution was already in full swing. The Keynesian framework had become the dominant one. It was too late to do anything about it. Okay, now, around this time, the 1940s, the fortunes of the Austrian school suffered a dramatic reversal. Okay, the Austrian theory of capital, which was an important part of the Austrian business cycle theory, was attacked by the Cambridge economist Piero Sraffa and also by the American economist Frank Knight, while the business cycle theory itself was largely forgotten over all the excitement over Keynes and the general theory. Also, beginning with Hayek's move to London in 1931 and continuing throughout the early 1930s and the early 1940s, the Austrian economists began to emigrate from Austria. So Mises himself, of course, left Vienna in 1934 for Geneva, just in anticipation of the Nazi takeover of Austria. The others who I mentioned all began to leave Europe and mostly ended up in the U.S. Hayek stayed at the LSE until 1950, when he moved to the U.S. and joined the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. So other Austrians of Hayek's generation, like Habeler and Morgenstern and Machlup, as I mentioned before, became very prominent scholars in the U.S., but their work really, they didn't really show much of the Austrian influence at that point. Their work didn't seem to have much to do with the tradition of Menger and Mises and so on. So the Austrian school as a movement pretty much died out by then. It no longer had a physical home at the University of Vienna. Its proponents became scattered, and many of them sort of fell away and began to embrace alternative perspectives, Walrasian, Marshallian, and so on. I should mention as a footnote that if you haven't read it before, Joe Salerno's paper on the place of human action in the history of economic thought in the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics, I highly recommend to you. Joe makes the point that institutionally the Austrian school remained strong until the early 1940s, but its intellectual core, what we might call Austrian price theory, or what Joe and I call causal realist market analysis, had already started to fade a little bit. There were some internal controversies in the late 19-teens, early 1920s, so that sort of the intellectual core of the Austrian tradition was already beginning to die out before the institutions followed suit. Okay, so Hayek ends up in Chicago. And once again, he finds himself in a really exciting place. It's almost, looking back on Hayek's career, it's almost like he had a knack for being in the right place at the right time. In Vienna, when it was one of the world's great centers of learning in economics, then at LSE, when it was one of the most exciting places to study economics, and then at Chicago in the 50s, when it was one of the world's leading centers of research in economics, the famous Chicago School. So here, Hayek is surrounded by Frank Knight and Milton Friedman, and then later George Stigler, young Gary Becker, and so on. Now, Hayek was never fully embraced by the economists at Chicago, and certainly is not a member in any way of the Chicago School. Hayek's position, as I mentioned, was not in the economics department. The economics department didn't want him, but he was able to secure a position in this sort of an unusual interdisciplinary group called the Committee on Social Thought, which had some economists and historians and other social theorists. So Hayek was friendly with the Chicago economists, but was not one of them. Excuse me. Moreover, Hayek's salary was not paid by the university, but was paid by a private foundation, the Volcker Fund, the same foundation that paid Mises' salary at NYU when Mises had a position as a visiting professor at NYU, and the same foundation for which Murray Rothbard worked in the 1950s and 1960s and was responsible for supporting Rothbard as he produced Man, Economy, and State. Furthermore, at this time, Hayek himself was not doing a lot of work in pure economics anymore. his interests had sort of drifted away from mainstream economics, what was becoming the mainstream at that time. Remember that this is 1940s, 1950s, is when economics in the Western world underwent a really fundamental transformation away from the largely verbal and causal modes of expression and reasoning that are still embraced by the Austrian school to a more mechanistic, quantitative, mathematical version. Right? Paul Samuelson's book, Foundations of Economic Analysis, that expressed basic economic theory in the language of constrained optimization and so on, that came out in 1947 and established physics as the science for economics to imitate. Friedman's 1953 essay on positive economics set a new standard for economic method, and the kind of economic theory that Hayek did was considered sort of trite and old-fashioned and archaic. And Hayek admits he wasn't really all that interested in economics at that point. More interested in psychology, philosophy, politics. And so this was really a dark time for the Austrian school as a movement. Hayek says that at this point in his career, quote, "I had become somewhat stale as an economist and felt much out of sympathy with the direction in which economics was developing. Though I still regarded the work I'd done during the 1940s on scientific method, history of ideas, and political theory as temporary excursions into another field, i.e. a few articles outside of economics done just for fun, I found it difficult to return to systematic teaching of economic theory and felt it rather as a release that I was not forced to do so by my teaching duties." So Hayek didn't have to teach any economic theory courses at Chicago. He just taught whatever he was sort of interested in at the moment. Now, certainly it's true that some very important works in Austrian economic theory came out in the 1950s, 1960s, and early 1970s. Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State came out in 1962. America's Great Depression in 1963, What Has Government Done to Our Money, also in 1963. Israel Kirzner's book Essay on Capital came out in 1966, and then his book on competition and entrepreneurship came out in 1973. So clearly there was important work being done in the Austrian tradition during this time, but there wasn't any sort of organized Austrian movement. That's really my point. No seminars, no Austrian seminars, journals, conferences, institutes. Publicly, at least, the Austrian tradition was just sort of a historical phenomenon. Then, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, Hayek gets the Nobel Prize in 1974. And interest in the Austrian school among mainstream economists was suddenly and strongly revived. They say that the reaction of most economists when hearing the news that Hayek was one of the winners in 1974 was either, "Who?" or "Is he still alive? Some guy who wrote on business cycles in the 1930s. I thought he was long dead." But so Hayek becomes a public figure again in the 1970s. It's important to note that what we now call the Austrian Revival had already started at that point. The famous South Royalton Conference, Walter, you were one of the attendees there. Many of the faculty here as young graduate students, young professors. I know it's hard to imagine people like Walter Block as a young man, but they attended a famous conference in South Royalton, Vermont, also in 1974, where Rothbard and Kirzner and Ludwig Lachmann were the main speakers. And this is really sort of the formative event of the Austrian Revival as a movement. But then when Hayek gets the Nobel Prize, it just gives it a lot of additional momentum. Hayek's books and articles were republished. Hayek went on speaking tours. He continued to write new material. He produced his last book, The Fatal Conceit, in 1988 when he was 89 years old. He died in 1992 in Germany, in Freiburg, where he had lived since leaving Chicago in 1962. Okay, so what exactly were Hayek's main contributions to economic theory, to economic analysis? What is his legacy in economics? Well, Hayek's legacy is, I would say, complex. Among mainstream economists, He's known mostly for The Road to Serfdom, which was a popular book, not really a scholarly book, and for some of his papers on knowledge in the 1930s and 1940s, although his conclusions are typically disputed by the mainstream economists. His business cycle work is not as well known among the mainstream, which is which is ironic because that's the work that was cited in the Nobel Award, not the stuff on knowledge and spontaneous order, but rather his work on the business cycle. It's not clear that mainstream economics has really incorporated many of Hayek's ideas. Among Austrians, Hayek's influence is undeniably immense, but somewhat controversial. We'll talk about those controversies in just a few moments. Let me just walk you through some of the core ideas, and these will be ideas that will be familiar to you, at least in part, from other lectures that you've heard this week. First, business cycle theory. This is widely regarded by those in the know as Hayek's most important contribution to economics. And this is where Hayek built on Mises' work in Theory of Money and Credit to show how fluctuations in economy-wide output and employment are linked to the capital structure of the economy. Okay? And so Hayek begins with this concept of the structure of production, which you've seen these Hayekian triangles in Roger Garrison's presentation and elsewhere. The idea that the value of production increases through time as goods and services are produced, starting with capital goods, raw materials, intermediate products, and so on, until we get on to final goods. Production takes time, in other words. And so factors have to be committed in the present for making final goods and services that will only have value in the future after they're sold. This is a point that we made yesterday in the lecture on production and entrepreneurship. But capital goods aren't identical. As capital goods are used, they become specific to particular places in the structure of production, meaning that if consumers change their demands for final goods and services, the economy's structure of production cannot instantly and costlessly be transformed into a new structure to produce an alternative set of goods and services because resources have already been committed to processes that take time that are already sort of halfway through. So the main sort of macroeconomic problem in Hayek's conception is what Roger Garrison calls intertemporal coordination. In other words, how do we get a structure of production that matches consumer wants, okay, such that when production is completed, we'll have the goods and services that consumers desire. Now, what Hayek showed in his work on money is that expansion of the money supply by banks and by government agencies, by lowering the rate of interest below what Mises had called its natural rate, distorts this structure of production. Okay? It's interesting to note that some modern theories of business cycles, whether they be Keynesian or new classical or new Keynesian, really don't include these sort of intermediate stage production processes. They look at things like the effects of the total money supply on total output without looking at the effects on relative prices among different sectors of the economy, among markets. The Austrian approach, as developed by Mises and by Hayek, focuses not on the aggregate money supply, but on the means by which money enters the economy and the distortions that are produced, that are created in the economy's capital structure. So for Hayek, investments in some stages of production are malinvestments or improper investments if they don't help to line up the structure of production with consumer wants. So when monetary policy lowers the interest rate below its natural rate, there's an overinvestment in early stage production processes that take a very long period of time and an underinvestment in later stage production processes, such that the economy's capital structure no longer matches up with consumer desires. And this leads to the boom and the eventual bust as the malinvestments are uncovered and subsequently liquidated. So every artificial boom in Hayek's framework sort of contains the seeds of its own destruction. It's self-reversing because eventually the malinvestments must be liquidated. The point is that economic fluctuations, such as the Great Depression, are not the outcome of not sort of the natural outcome of the market process, but rather the result of government-induced distortions in the money and credit markets, which lead to distortions in the economy's capital structure. Let me say a few words about Hayek's work on knowledge. This is a contribution that has been, as I mentioned before, widely influential within the Austrian school, but is somewhat controversial, and there's some problems which we'll discuss in just a moment. This Hayek's work on knowledge, prices, and what he calls competition as a discovery procedure. It's the title of one of Hayek's articles in the 1960s. What's the argument? Well, Hayek says when we talk about sort of the economic problem facing a society, it's really not, it's a mischaracterization to say, well, the economic problem is how to allocate scarce means to unlimited ends. In fact, Hayek says the problem is how do we secure the best use of resources given that not everyone in the economy knows what the best use of those resources is. In other words, if knowledge is fragmented or dispersed or spread out throughout an economy, how do we allocate resources such that we can take advantage of this dispersion of knowledge? The way Hayek says it in his famous 1945 paper, The Use of Knowledge in Society, is this way. He says, the economic problem of society is thus not merely a problem of how to allocate given resources, if given is taken to mean given to a single mind which deliberately solves the problem set by these data. In other words, solving a calculus problem like you do in your classes back home. It's rather a problem of how to secure the best use of resources known to any of the members of society for ends whose relative importance only those individuals know. Or, to put it briefly, it is a problem of the utilization of knowledge not given to anyone in its totality. So the fact that there is no central agent, there is no single mind which possesses all the knowledge and therefore can implement a detailed plan that can be executed from the top down, implemented from the top down. Therefore, we have to figure out some other way to allocate resources. That knowledge is not available to a central agent. We need some kind of a decentralized system in which decision-making is delegated to individuals who can make use of the specific knowledge that they have. Key to Hayek's argument here is what he calls tacit knowledge, meaning that much of the knowledge that is necessary for making economic decisions is not sort of explicit knowledge that can be written down and communicated easily from one person to another, but rather is in a form that cannot easily be articulated. The knowledge is tacit rather than explicit. I use the example with my students of the knowledge necessary to ride a bicycle. So imagine that you have a friend that you're corresponding with by email who's halfway around the globe, and that person has never ridden a bike before, and you have to teach them how to ride a bike. I mean, in principle, you could write down the steps, right? You could make up a recipe. Well, you start and you stand next to the bike and you hold the handlebars and you put one leg over and you put your feet on the pedals and you turn your feet and off you go, right? Person reads the instructions, gets on the bike. What happens? Right? They fall flat on their face. You can't ride a bike by reading a set of instructions, right? You have to learn how to do it through experience because there are all kinds of subtleties associated with how you shift your weight and which way to lean and how to hold the handlebars. If you know how to ride a bike, that knowledge is in you. But you don't know how to articulate it in words where you could sort of communicate it to somebody else. Okay, that's what this is sort of thing that Hayek means by tacit knowledge. The point being, if all of the necessary knowledge were of the form that could be written down in a recipe, well then even though the central planner doesn't have all the information, you could just write it down and email it to him. And then the dictator could allocate resources effectively. But even if you wanted to, even if you were good socialist citizen drones, you couldn't communicate your knowledge to the dictator, to the central planner, because you don't know how to express it in a form that it could be communicated in words or numbers or whatever. Well, how do market participants learn what to do given that they don't possess all of the necessary tacit knowledge to make decisions that are correct every time. Well, according to Hayek, they learn by competing in the marketplace. So competition should be understood as a process of discovery where market participants can sort of try out conjectures about what products, what goods and services will sell, how much satisfaction they'll get out of consuming a particular good or service, and so on. But allowing people to compete with each other allows them to capture or to learn or discover the sort of specific knowledge that they need. Hayek's 1948 paper called "The Meaning of Competition" is one of his best papers, I think, where he offers a very trenchant critique of sort of the standard neoclassical understanding of competition as a state of affairs characterized by a certain number of firms producing a certain kind of a product. Walter, I think you discussed this in one of your lectures, that we should think of competition not as a state of affairs, such as the perfectly competitive model, but rather as a process of interaction among agents, like a sporting competition. And Hayek has a great sort of critique of mainstream competition theory there. Out of this notion of competition as a discovery procedure emerges Hayek's concept of so-called spontaneous order. This is a term that you've probably seen in some of the Austrian literature. Hayek argues that market competition produces a kind of order, or design if you like, that is not the product of top-down deliberate decision-making, but rather emerges from the bottom up in a decentralized, distributed kind of fashion. This order is what he calls, is the product, quote, of human action but not human design, a phrase that Hayek borrowed from Adam Smith's mentor, Adam Ferguson, meaning that the independent, uncoordinated actions of a group of individuals can lead to overall results that are socially beneficial even without anyone deliberately designing such an end. So the idea of Adam Smith's invisible hand. There's some difficulties in interpreting exactly what Hayek means by spontaneous order. Does it mean that no social institution should ever be designed from the top down? Or does it mean that it isn't necessary to be designed from the top down to be okay? We can get into some of that in the Q&A if you like. Now, on to a little bit of controversy. What about, what was Hayek's relationship with Mises, his intellectual relationship? And some have argued that Hayek, in his later years, drifted away from Mises, certainly on issues like methodology, that Hayek was much more, became very heavily influenced by his close friend Karl Popper, the philosopher of science, who popularized the falsification criterion as a criterion for scientific statements. Hayek and Mises maintained a warm personal relationship, but many have claimed that Hayek began to move away from Mises and began to embrace Popper and others. So the way some of us have described the evolution of the Austrian school, you can think of sort of a main line or a main branch, sort of the most orthodox Austrians, if you want to use that term, starting with Menger and going down to boehm-bawerk, then Mises, then Rothbard, and various, what you might call side branches, Austrians who were a little bit more independent-minded and a little bit more idiosyncratic. Wieser would certainly be one of those, and Hayek would be one as well. Hayek was actually influenced heavily by Walras through Joseph Schumpeter, Mises' contemporary, who was Austrian by birth but Walrasian by inclination. For example, in the literature on the problem of economic calculation under socialism, the perspective taken by Hayek on this problem is somewhat distinct from the perspective undertaken by Mises. So Hayek emphasizes this problem of knowledge, tacit knowledge that we discussed earlier, and says that socialism doesn't work well because the central planning board cannot possess the necessary specific knowledge or tacit knowledge to plan. The way Mises formulates the problem is a bit different, that because a socialist economy lacks private property in the means of production, there can be no market prices for factors of production, and then no way for the planner to calculate what's the most efficient means of producing particular goods and services, given the complexities of the economy's capital structure, the many different production techniques that could potentially be used. Some interpreters have claimed that, well, Mises and Rothbard are really saying, Mises and Hayek are really saying the same thing, but just slightly different language or mode of expression. Others have argued that Mises and Hayek are offering really fundamentally distinct arguments. And I can give you references if you like, but there's quite a lot of literature in the Review of Austrian Economics and the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics trying to sort out the different positions of these two. There's some articles by Salerno on Hayek have sort of brought about what some have called the debate over dehomogenization debate. And I know that's not a great word, but Salerno wrote an article called Mises and Hayek Dehomogenized, but he borrowed it's a play on the title of a famous article on the marginal revolutionaries called Menger, Jevons, and Valra Dehomogenized. And so Salerno wrote a piece explaining how Hayek's position is different from Mises on various issues. It's certainly true that Hayek is interested in a lot of concepts, group selection, spontaneous order, that are not present at all in Mises. Hayek himself says, sorry, I've lost, let's see. Hayek himself distinguishes his epistemology from Mises in the sense that Mises was much more of a rationalist in the continental tradition. Hayek considered himself more of the British skeptic tradition, the Humean skeptical tradition, and thought that that Mises' rationalist approach was inappropriate. I want to have time for questions. In Salerno's interpretation, we can really think of two strands of Austrian economics, both with roots in Menger, right? One is the Wieser-Hayek-Kerzner strand, which focuses on the knowledge problem, the problem of dispersed knowledge, and describes the price system as a communications device, communications network or system. Very much in the general equilibrium tradition, not using the Walrasian method of expression, but what you might call verbal general equilibrium theory. And then another strand, the boehm-bawerk, Mises, Rothbard strand, which focuses more on monetary calculation and the appraisal of factors of production by entrepreneurs. Let me stop and see if there's some questions that I can cover now, and other questions that you might have we can discuss later in the week. But
so Rothbard wasn't a fan of Hayek's Constitution of Liberty. What did Mises think about Hayek's political philosophy?
Yeah, the question is moving away from economics for a moment, but to political theory. Hayek's 1960 book, Constitution of Liberty, is regarded by a lot of mainstream political scientists as sort of the quintessential classical liberal or libertarian treatise. But the book was not well received by most, well received by many classical liberals. Rothbard in particular was very negative on the Constitution of Liberty. The question is, what did Mises think of Hayek's political philosophy? Mises wrote or said very little that was directly critical of any of his students' younger followers. So he never wrote a negative review, and was always always praised Hayek publicly. There's certainly differences. If you read Mises' liberalism, you can see a lot of differences in Mises' understanding of classical liberalism and Hayek's. But Mises, I'm not aware of anything, Walter, maybe you are on the record, where Mises pointed out specific problems that he had with Hayek's theory of constitutions and so on. Man, Mises was a nice guy. Please.
Can you talk about a personal relationship with between Hayek and Guido Miro, who shared a reply system?
Okay. question is, can I comment on the personal relationship between Hayek and Myrdal, the two who won the Nobel Prize? I don't know what I can say since we're broadcasting on the air. There's been some sort of salacious details that have been alleged in the rumor mills about this. And they knew each other, and they didn't like each other. Hayek was acquainted with Myrdal and also Myrdal's wife Alva, with whom Gunnar Myrdal did most of his work. Did you have something specific in mind?
I don't have any, so I want to know.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, let's just put it this way: they didn't have any important professional relationship. They didn't debate each other or write a book together or anything like that. So. Please.
So Leonardo talks about how when Human Action came out, that Hayek was, in a sense, surprised because he felt like Mises was almost in the dark about many recent developments in mainstream economic theory. Was Hayek always of the opinion of trying to incorporate the separate Austrian tradition in sort of this all-encompassing mainstream view, or did he ever sort of gravitate back to an understanding of that separate Austrian tradition?
That's a good question. The question is, did Hayek consider himself to be part of a distinct Austrian tradition or more of an eclectic kind of mainstream tradition? Did he feel like the Austrian school should try to incorporate the latest developments from other schools of thought? Is that a
middle of his life compared to...
Yeah, at different times in his life. It's a difficult question to answer because Mises, Hayek, and others in Vienna, on the one hand, they understood the distinctiveness of the Vienna tradition. They thought Menger's approach was revolutionary and extremely really important, but they considered themselves to be doing just correct economics, not sort of a unique, distinct, unorthodox brand of economics. They thought what they were doing was mainstream economics, and Valra and people who were doing other sort of weird things was just sort of, they were kind of deviationists, right? I mean, they didn't use the term Austrian school very much, except when they were doing sort of a history of thought piece explaining a little bit about the tradition in Vienna. They just considered themselves to be doing good economics. You have to remember, especially in Mises' time, beginning of Hayek's career, the leading schools of thought in economics included the German historical school and sort of the old institutionalist tradition, which was opposed to economic theory altogether. There's a statement in Mises, one of his early essays that's in Epistemological Problems of Economics, where Mises says something like, well, the differences between the schools of Vienna, between the Austrian school, the Lausanne or Valrasian school, and the Jevons school are really just minor differences of exposition. And you read that, you think, wait a minute, what's he talking? The Austrian school isn't distinct from mainstream mathematical economics? What was he talking about? What he meant was all of these traditions were theoretically oriented, and they believed in the importance of economic theory, and they were united against the evil German historicists. Right? So I guess the point that I'm trying to make is it's difficult for us, it's a little bit anachronistic, I guess, for us to sort of project backwards kind of the landscape of economics as it exists today with a mainstream neoclassical orthodox tradition that's very distinct from the Austrian tradition, which is not in the mainstream. I mean, that's not really a very direct answer to your question. Hayek was very, if you look at sort of sources that he cites, in mid-career he was very sympathetic to what we would now consider non-Austrian writers and sources. So he didn't consider himself a big radical in the middle of his career, but rather sort of an orthodox guy. Later when he did some of his writings on, later writings on money, for example, in the 1970s, denationalization of money, he was very self-consciously radical. So maybe he had a different spirit at that point. Yes, please.
What was Hayek's view on the equilibrium theory in economics? I know a lot of Austrians feel that we're always disequilibrium, but moving towards equilibrium, and some feel that we're disequilibrium, can't even say we're moving towards equilibrium, whereas the mainstream kind of equilibrium theory of economics, that we're kind of always in.
That's a good question. The question is, where does Hayek come down on questions about equilibrium? And there's one interpretation of the Austrian position today that says, well, mainstream economics believes that we're always in equilibrium, and the Austrians believe that the economy is not in equilibrium. Some of them think there's a systematic tendency towards equilibrium, and some of them think that the economy never equilibrates. Where does Hayek fit in that whole debate? Actually, I have an article coming out in the QJAE next year that tries to point out that the Austrian view on equilibrium is a little bit more complicated than it's told in that story. That there are a lot of different notions of equilibrium in the literature. That Mises and Hayek in his business cycle writings in the 1930s did use a kind of equilibrium reasoning. They didn't use the language at all that emerged in the 70s and 80s in some branches of the Austrian school about the tendency toward equilibrium and the market process as opposed to a state of affairs. They didn't use that terminology at all. There's quite a lot of explicit equilibrium reasoning in Hayek's business cycle books in the 1930s. Now, Hayek's writings on knowledge and competition and spontaneous order were used in this equilibrium versus disequilibrium debate in the 70s and 80s within the Austrian school. I personally think that debate was not terribly productive, and that there's some misunderstanding even by within the Austrian school of what the proper approach to equilibrium should be. That the question of whether the economy is systematically tending towards some kind of long-run equilibrium or not isn't really the right question. That what we are interested in is explaining the real prices of goods and services that we pay in the marketplace every day. And those are, in a sense, equilibrium prices. As to sort of some hypothetical long-run state, Mises' evenly rotating economy, that's purely a mental construct. It's just a foil, a reasoning tool, but the economy never achieves it, and the economy isn't tending towards some long-run, evenly rotating economy. It's moving from one short-run equilibrium to the next. It's a sort of a roundabout way of saying, no, Hayek didn't participate directly in that debate, but a lot of his ideas emerged, particularly by the sort of disequilibrium, in the disequilibrium wing in the 80s. Do you want to clarify that, Walter? Okay, well then you have to wait your turn. Somebody else was ahead of you. No, go ahead. You can take professor's privilege.
I wanted to add to your very beautiful rendition one or 2 points. One is that if I were to say who is the most eminent follower of Hayek, at least on macro, it would be Roger Garrison, who is maybe Hayek's chief Hayekian or something in terms of doing more with the triangle than even Hayek. So he sort of added to and elaborated upon.
But you've got some critiques of the triangle too, don't you?
Yeah, that's true, but irrelevant to the fact that Roger
Right.
is Hayek's main student and follower in this regard. The other thing is, in my view, Hayek was much more of a movement person. At one time, I think at the Welton conference, he was saying things like, at one time I thought I would be the last Austrian alive, and I'm glad to see so many young people. Lachmann also was a real movement type. He'd always say, you must smash them and stuff like that. Also, I wanted to add that in Joe Salerno's analysis, which I'm sure you would agree with, the reason we had a Welton conference of Kerzner, Lachmann, and Rothbard, and maybe 25 younger people, was because of Murray Rothbard's book in 1962. So the real revival of Joe Salerno
Right.
said started in 62, not 74.
And that's a great point. Just to repeat for those in the audio listening remotely, Walter Block pointed out that Roger Garrison has done more than anybody to explicate Hayek's business cycle work and to describe, move beyond the Hayekian triangle in his diagrammatic work. And also this good point about South Royalton, that Joe Salerno reminds us that the young scholars who gathered in 1974 at this conference that sort of launched the Austrian Revival had all become Austrians from reading Man, Economy, and State and America's Great Depression in the 1960s. So really, it was Rothbard's writings that led to this Austrian revival that manifested itself a few years later. That's a good point. We maybe have time for one or two more.
Beyond the Institute, how would you qualify the state of affairs regarding the Austrian school? Where are we? I mean, where are people?
Yeah.
Do you have any prominent Austrian school leaders in key positions?
Right.
What's going on?
The question is, what, can I say something about the position of the Austrian school today? In many ways, the Austrian school is much, much stronger today than it has been for decades because information technology, right? With not only the Mises Institute as a physical entity, but through the web, Austrian writings and Austrian views are known, to many times more people today and are accessible to people all around the world. It was never the case in the past. And maybe Walter can comment on this too. But in fact, I've heard Walter say many times, you used to be able to count, every Austrian would be a personal friend, and there was like a dozen of them in the world, and you knew them all. Right now, I mean, there's thousands of them. And articles are being submitted to the Austrian journals, and scholars are coming to Austrian conferences that none of us have ever even heard of before, and presenting outstanding work. So that's a sense in which the Austrian school is much stronger today than it was in the past. Now, sort of institutionally, it's true that Austrian economists don't have the most prestigious positions at Ivy League schools, and boehm-bawerk was Minister of Finance in Austria. Menger and boehm-bawerk, and other members of the Austrian school held the most prestigious academic positions in Vienna and were some of the most widely respected academics in Europe. We're not there, at least not in the English-speaking world. There are many parts of the world where Austrian economics is growing even more rapidly than it is here. Eastern Europe, for example, places like the Czech Republic, Poland. There are very strong Austrian movements within some of the leading universities. Again, it's hard to answer the question without a more. We'd have to figure out what is the measurement criterion. How do we gauge the health or vitality of the school? If we look in terms of research that's being done, students and lay people who are being exposed to the teachings of the Austrian school, we're in much better shape now than we ever were. Did you want to comment on that, Walter?
President of the United States might possibly will be a lay Austrian economist.
So that's a very good point. Walter's got his bags packed, ready to move into the White House as chief economic advisor. Okay. Well, I think we're out of time, so we'll call it to a halt. Thank you.